this is the marking video for inherited disorders, and make sure you have your blue pen for your notes and your green pen for your answers. So the first question says, polydactyly is a genetic disorder that leads to extra fingers or toes. So this is your phenotype, is what you see because of the genotype. The photograph shows a person with a hand with polydactyly. First question, is polydactyly caused by a dominant or recessive allele? You need to know it is caused by a dominant allele. We have to complete the table below to show the different genotypes and phenotypes for polydactyly using the letters D, capital D or lowercase d for genotype. So the first row we have, the scientific term is heterozygous, hetero meaning different, so we know the genotype will be capital D, lowercase d, and we know that this is a dominant disease, so even if you have one of the capital D's, it masks the recessive allele, and so this person does have polydactyly as well. So with polydactyly. The second row, another person with polydactyly, and there's only two choices here. So with polydactyly is heterozygous, also with polydactyly is homozygous dominant. And as that last row is without, lowercase d, and they're homozygous recessive. You need 2 per 1 mark, so if you get all 4, you gain 2 marks there. A man is heterozygous to polydactyly, and his wife does not have polydactyly. So the first thing I think heterozygous must mean it's capital D, lowercase d, and because the wife doesn't have it, it must be lowercase d, lowercase d. What are the chances of their children having polydactyly? Well, here's my genetic diagram that I've drawn already, and I need to add in. So we'll add in the man, which is uppercase d, lowercase d, and the woman, which is lowercase d, and we cross as so. Lowercase d, lowercase d, lowercase d, and on the side I've written out all the genotypes they could possibly. Remember, each square is worth 25%. So capital C, capital D, 0%. Capital D, lowercase d, where there's 2 squares, so therefore it's 50%. And lowercase d is 50%. There are 2 squares. And so with polydactyly, again, to remind ourselves, capital D and capital C and capital C and lowercase d are those with polydactyly. So this is with, and this is without. So with polydactyly, 0% times plus 50 is 50%, and also without polydactyly is also 50%. So what are the, and this we have to go back and refer back to the question. So what are the chances of children having polydactyly? Well, the final answer is 50% of the children with polydactyly. Next question then, if we look at this diagram, it shows a genetic inheritance of cystic fibrosis in the family. So firstly, cystic fibrosis, excuse me, cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele, and it causes problems with the cell membrane. So here we have a mother, which is a carrier, and a father that's a carrier. And if I look ahead, they've used N as the symbol. So we know the mother will be a carrier, heterozygous, so it will be capital N, lowercase n, and the father is capital N, lowercase m. Child B is going to be capital N, lowercase n, and child C, capital N, lowercase m, because they are carriers. Child D has nothing, and we know a recessive allele means that you have to have the disease if you have a recessive allele, and so if child D does not have cystic fibrosis, we know child D will be 2 capital N's, and child A who has it will be a lowercase n, like so. So what you can do is write out the 3 options on the side and decide, will this child have cystic fibrosis? Nope. This one, nope, because again the dominant allele masks the recessive, and this one will, because it's a recessive. You need 2 recessive alleles to get the disease. Firstly, what is an allele? They are different forms of the gene. you can't say different types, so they do not accept different types because they are not different types, they're different forms, different types. The mother and father are both carriers of cystic fibrosis. As you know, it's capital N, lowercase n. What does a carrier mean? That both parents do not have the symptoms. They do not have symptoms of cystic fibrosis and they are heterozygous. That's what a carrier means. We have to draw a Punnett Square to show the probability that the children are carriers of cystic fibrosis. Remember, you're reading the question to make sure that at the very end you answer, and these are your symbols. So, again, both parents are heterozygous. So we have the father and the mother, and it doesn't matter which way round you do it, as long as you cross correctly, like so. So, remember, each square is worth 25%. So we have here capital N, 25%. 2 squares, capital N and lowercase n, 50%, and 25%, again, lowercase n, lowercase n. On the side, I like to tick and cross to remind myself if they have. Remember, it's a recessive disorder. So only the recessive order will have cystic fibrosis. This doesn't, because it doesn't have a recessive allele, and remember this one, the dominant will mask the recessive, so therefore they do not. So with cystic fibrosis is only the one with a tick, 25%. Without cystic fibrosis will be these two, so add a set 25 plus 50 is 75%. But again, we need to answer the question. The question asks for which ones are carriers. Carriers are heterozygous. So therefore, it is 50% of the children with that are carriers. We move on. Pompe is a disorder that is an inherited condition that affects thousands of people. It's caused by a GAA gene. That's just extra information. We don't need to know about it. But it does ask you, what is a gene made of? Well, it's made up of a small section of DNA. You get the mark if you write DNA. The figure 1 shows the inheritance of Pompe disorder in one family, and the key thing here is that it's caused by a recessive allele. Like CF, you need 2 copies to have Pompe. You need 2 lowercase letters to have it. So person 2 has the disorder. What is the genotype of this person 2? So if they have the disorder, so what we can do, again, we'll write on the side the 3 probabilities that you can get, or the 3 genotypes you can get. As we said, it's a recessive, so therefore this one does have Pompe disorder and this one does not. This one, the dominant masks the recessive allele, so they do not. So what's the genotype of person 2? If we look at person 2, we use our key. It is female with the disorder. Therefore, we know with is lowercase r. Explain why, or explain how we can tell that the disorder is caused by a recessive allele. You could say it skips generations, but to be more specific, you need to use the numbers themselves. So persons 6 and 7 don't have it. You can see 6 and 7 don't have the disorder. However, one of their children, 8, do have the disorder. So I'll make it really clear. They do not have it, they do not have it, and they do. So 8 has 2 parents who don't show any symptoms, yet 8 does have the disorder itself. So person 6 and 7 do not have it, but their child does. That shows that each parent must be a carrier. In other words, they're capital R, lowercase r, and person 8 is lowercase r, lowercase r. If you do a Punnett Square to show this, you can show that both parents are heterozygous. So we have the father and the mother, and we can show them by crossing that both with 2 heterozygous parents you can get 25% chance of the child with the disorder. Person 6 and 7 decide to have another child, and we complete the diagram. Oh, it's actually in fact what we've just done there. So we complete the Punnett Square. Remember, the dominant always comes before the recessive. So there is 1 square, 25%, 2 squares, 50%, 1 square, 25%, With Pompe, well, again, if you want to remind ourselves, Pompe is recessive. That means you need 2 lowercase to get the disease. The others do not have. So with Pompe, it's only 25%. Without is 75%. So drawing around any offspring who will have the disorder, I'm looking for 2 lowercase r's. That's the ring I'm drawing. And it's 25% or 0.25. Next is a diagram shows the human body cell, and we need to be able to know which part of the cell contains the allele and is affected. So if we label first the different parts, we have the nucleus for A, we have B, we have the cell membrane, C, we have the cytoplasm, and D, we have mitochondria. Remember, they're not chloroplasts because this is an animal cell, not a plant cell. Now add that in. A human body cell is an animal cell. So the one that contains the allele for cystic fibrosis is where the DNA is found. The DNA is found in the nucleus, therefore the answer is A. Which one's affected by cystic fibrosis? Well, the cystic fibrosis is a problem with the cell membrane, so the answer is B. Turning over, we have another syndrome. This is Stickler Syndrome, which is caused by a dominant allele. Again, if we can use any letters here as we are not given any, so I'll use capital A. So A, and 2 lowercases a. If it's caused by a dominant, it means if it has at even 1 copy of the dominant allele, they will have the disease. There are 2 copies, they will. They have 1 copy, they will, and this one does not have the disease. So we have inheritance in 2 families. So this is family 1, and that's family 2. So family 1 and family 2. So explain why none of the children of persons 7 and 8, so we're looking at these 2, have Stickler syndrome. Well, first thing you need to think of, if they do not have it, they have to either they have to be lowercase a. That's the only way they cannot have the syndrome. So the first thing we can mention is that the parents 7 and 8, which are these who don't have Stickler syndrome, they are 2 lowercase a, as we've decided there, and so their children won't have the dominant allele. They cannot inherit the capital A. If you do a cross where both parents are lowercase a, every single child is going to be lowercase a. It's 100% chance of lowercase a, and that means they do not have the syndrome. Last question, we have Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and they have a history of cystic fibrosis in their families. Whenever I see the word cystic fibrosis, I like to remind myself that this is a recessive, caused by a recessive allele. Neither of them have cystic fibrosis. So the way, again, to remind myself, how do I remember? I write in, let's use, in the past, I think we've used in a previous question for cystic fibrosis, we have used N, so we can use N now again. So capital N, lowercase n, lowercase m. It's caused by recessive. I need 2 copies for someone. I need 2 copies for someone to have cystic fibrosis. So therefore, yes, they have cystic fibrosis, no, and no. So they do not have cystic fibrosis. So they can either be capital N or capital N, lowercase n. They're concerned that their child might have cystic fibrosis, and they decide to visit a genetic counsellor to discuss embryonic screening. This is screening embryos, usually outside of the womb. And we have information. So they receive 5 eggs removed from Mrs. Johnson's ovaries, and these are fertilized in a dish. This is outside using the sperm cells. The embryos are grown in the dish until they are about 30 cells. So we have 5 eggs, they are removed, they are put into a dish, and they add the sperm cell to fertilized. And once it's fertilized, 1 cell that has been fertilized is tested, it's screened for cystic fibrosis, and if they does not have cystic fibrosis, this one is put back into the woman, Mrs. Johnson, so she is pregnant. Any other embryos, the remaining 4, will be destroyed. So firstly, why are they taking 5 eggs and not 1 egg? Well, if they take 5 eggs, there's a greater chance of screening them for a healthy egg or embryo. When we mean healthy, it means an egg without cystic fibrosis. Big question here, evaluate the use of embryonic screening. Remember to give a conclusion. Now, I'll come back to that, but when it says give a conclusion, you cannot get full marks, in this case, 4 marks without this conclusion. So the advantages of embryonic screening is that it has a greater chance of a child not having CF. If a child does not have cystic fibrosis, it reduces the suffering of any people that do have cystic fibrosis. Next, a child with cystic fibrosis is expensive to treat or to bring up, especially you got the medicine, you have the treatment, they are expensive. And finally, the cystic fibrosis gene is not passed on to future generations. If the child is born being lowercase n, they will have no, if the child is born with uppercase n, there is no chance of passing the recessive allele to the future generations. Disadvantages, however, is that screening is expensive. The screening process itself might not be available for everyone because of the cost. And there is a risk of infection when you remove the embryos from the woman. Finally, it is possible to damage the embryos when you screen them. So we have all these options here. For 4 marks, the first 3 marks come from naming 2 advantages and 1 disadvantage. But to gain the 4th and final mark, you must have a conclusion. And the conclusion must have a positive advantageous statement and a negative statement in your conclusion. So an example 2 that I've written is that it is right to use embryonic screening because the child will not have cystic fibrosis even though it's expensive. Can you see I'm using a comparative here, even though? Another example I've written, it is wrong because embryos being removed can have a risk of infection despite the chance of a healthy baby. Again, using the word despite. You can use even though, whereas, despite to show that there is a positive and a negative. Please remember to write at the very front your final marks in your exam. Your teachers will be looking out for that, and thank you.